It's Freedom Friday. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to another edition of Your Turn with your host, Carl Gallups. Well, I'm so glad that you tuned us in. You can listen to us live if you'd like. We're streaming on the net at 1330weby.com. Just follow the link in the upper left-hand corner there on the page. And follow the instructions, and in no time you can be up and running and listening to us live streaming on the net. We're so proud that you're listening. Listen, today's show is going to be decidedly a little different, because what I'm going to share with you today needs to be said. And I believe that you need to hear it. The first hour of today's Your Turn is going to be dedicated to the truth about what is happening with Israel and the world. Today, if you will listen to this show, you will hear the truth. Why does everyone seem to hate Israel so much? What is up with the Palestinians and the Israelis? And who are the Palestinians? Do they really have a claim to the land of Israel? Is Israel really nothing more than an illegal occupying nation? And then why is that whole area over there called Palestine in the first place? Why does the news media constantly refer to that as Palestine? And how did the so-called Palestinians get there? How did the Jews get there? Was there ever a Palestinian nation before Israel? See, these and so many other questions are going to be answered for you today with verifiable, documented, historical fact. That's all in the first hour edition of Your Turn. Now, the second hour is going to be closely related, but I hope perhaps just as provocative, even more provocative, maybe even more thought-provoking. The second hour of today's Your Turn is going to be devoted to proving the existence of God. Undeniably, irrefutable proof that there is a God, and He is the God of the Bible, and that there are no other gods other than the God Yahweh of the Bible, and proof that the Bible is the only real Word of God, and that it is accurate. Now, the second hour, I'm going to deal with all of this because it is closely and directly connected with the presence of the nation of Israel in the world, and the hatred of the world directed toward Israel. Believe me when I tell you, it's connected to the proof of the existence of God, a God, the only God, the God of the Bible, and that the Bible is the only and final and accurate, true Word of God. Now, I know this probably sounds to you like it's going to be a religious show or a preaching show or like you go into church, but I promise you it's not going to be like that at all. I hope that you'll find this show absolutely fascinating. We're also going to deal in that second hour, by the way, with some biblical end-time prophecy as it relates to what's happening in the world today, especially, and again, as it relates to Israel. And so, regardless of your religious views or your political views, I trust that you will find this show today informative and enlightening and fascinating and, who knows, maybe even inspiring, perhaps even life-changing for you. Most of our listeners here know, most of our listeners here on WBY know that I have been for many, many years now also a pastor here in the local community in Santa Rosa County. I'm the pastor of Hickory Hammock Baptist Church. It's a Southern Baptist church on a major thoroughfare to the beach, a road called Hickory Hammock Road. Thus, the church derives its name from that road and that community, the Hickory Hammock Baptist Church. For over a couple of decades now, I've had the honor of being the pastor. So while most of the time on Your Turn, we talk about politics and local and regional and national and international affairs and the politics that go along with them. But I also come from an unashamedly biblical worldview. That is, I try to measure, because of who I am as a Christian and as a pastor, but I try to measure everything that I see around me through the Word of God. And I'm not ashamed of this. I come from a biblical worldview. I don't come from a secular worldview, that is, a view that just leaves out any thought of the existence of a God. I come from a biblical worldview, and the Bible interpreted in its context. I also host the Ask the Preacher program, heard right here on WEBY every week, every Sunday morning at 7:30, and again every Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So this topic about Israel and how it relates to politics and world affairs and international intrigue, and how it relates to the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about Israel and even the last days? Does Israel figure into all of this? Well, let me just tell you the answer. The answer is yes. For several thousand years, the Bible has been speaking, perhaps, of the days that we're living in. The Bible has been speaking of a time when Israel would come back to the land, and all of the political intrigue that would ensue after Israel came back to the land. Now, the reason I say came back to the land, most of our listeners, or a lot of our listeners, I suppose, have only lived in the time when Israel has been in the land, since 1948. But prior to 1948, there was a period of some 2,000 years of history when there was no Israel. Yet the Bible said and prophesied for all of those 2,000 years that there would be an Israel one day. Israel would come back to the land, even though the people had been scattered to the nations of the world, that there would arise among the nations a national Israel again, in the same place, basically the same borders, with the same or even greater power than she's ever had, and nations would be surrounding her that hated her, and people would be constantly attacking her, but yet no one would ever really be able to truly defeat her. The Bible said those words. Now, I'm paraphrasing them, but the Bible said those and many other amazing and fascinating things about Israel for 2,000 years, none of which came true until 1948. And here we are, over 60 years later, and there is Israel sitting here for over 60 years, surrounded by nations that hate her, basically within the same biblical border she had before, with a power like she never had before. Now she is nuclear armed, backed by nuclear superpowers. Nations of the world hate her. She's been attacked over and over and over again, yet she's never been defeated. And Israel is the center of world attention today. Tonight on the evening news. So what is all of this about? What is all of this about? So you can see that this topic is near and dear to me naturally. But listen, folks, more than that, it should be near and dear to you. Because again, regardless of your religious persuasion, regardless of your faith, or even if you have no faith at all, the fact remains that Israel is the center of world attention, and it has been for decades. And it appears, simply from a totally secular point of view, that it seems to be the flashpoint in the Middle East and world politics and United Nations proclamations. I mean, folks, it seems to me that if World War III were to start, and I pray that it doesn't happen in our lifetime, but the Bible seems to prophesy of an impending World War III, if you will. It seems that if World War III were to start, that it would almost have to have something to do with Israel. Because this climate that I'm speaking of is true, and you know it's true. So I hope that you'll stay tuned for this show today. Again, the first hour, right after we come back from our break, the first section of this show, the first part of our show today, of Your Turn, with your host, Carl Gallups, the first part of it is going to be dedicated to the historical, geopolitical, biblical truth, verifiable facts about Israel and why she's hated, who she really is, who are the Palestinians, why do the Palestinians hate Israel, why do the Palestinians claim that they have allegiance to or access to the land and Israel should not? Why do they call Israel occupiers? Why is it that nobody seems to be supporting Israel? I hope you'll stay tuned. Call other people. Gather them around. Record this show. You don't want to miss what you're going to hear next. Listen, before we go to our first break, you got to hear this. It comes from the Bible, the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, the first 3 verses, and then verse 9. This was written 2,400 years ago. This is before Israel came back to the land. This is when there was no Israel in the land. And listen to what the Word of God says. This is the word of the Lord concerning Israel, the Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the spirit of man within him, declares, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. And on that day, and by the way, this prophecy is speaking of the end times, the last days, just before the return of Jesus Christ. Verse 3 says, and on that day, when all of the nations of the earth have gathered against Israel, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all of the nations, and all who try to move it will injure themselves. And then listen to verse 9. And on that day I will set out to destroy all of the nations that attack Jerusalem. Pretty ominous words, written 2,400 years ago. 2,340 years before there was a nation of Israel on the world scene. Yet the Word of God had proclaimed that there would one day be an Israel, and that the nations of the earth would hate her, and they would attack her, but they would lose. Folks, in the evening news, now right before your eyes, this is happening. Stay tuned.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
Welcome back. It's Freedom Friday, a very special edition. We're so glad that you've stayed with us. You won't be disappointed. Welcome back to Your Turn with your host, Carl Gallups. Well, we're going to get right back to the topic of today's show. I hope that you will stay tuned for this show today, and I hope that you've already contacted some others to listen. This is extremely important. The information that you will hear today is extremely important. It's vitally important to your understanding of what's going on in the world. And it focuses on Israel. What's up with Israel? Why is there a nation called Israel? Why does the world seem to hate this nation so badly? Why is it that almost every nation of the world not only hates Israel, but has no intention of supporting Israel or even recognizing that Israel has a right to exist? And who are the Palestinians? Who are these people who continually say that they have claim to the land and that they're going to drive Israel into the sea and that Israel is going to be annihilated? And why is it that other nations of the world are joining in with this Palestinian movement? Why is it that the leaders of Iran are continually speaking for Israel's destruction? Why is it that the leaders of Syria are continually speaking for Israel's destruction? Why is it that Russia seems to have joined in with Iran now in these days, and helping to arm Iran with nuclear armaments, and supporting, or at least not condemning, Iran's statements about Israel. What is all of this about? And why is the United States so closely tied to Israel? Why is Great Britain so closely tied to Israel? These questions all will be answered in this show, and many, many, many more right here in this first segment. First of all, we just need to establish up front that there has never been a nation in that land that we're going to call Israel. There has never been a nation in that land other than the nation of Israel. And it was there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years as an established nation with a government and borders and walls and cities and a military and kings and coins, money, and a national economy and national trade, international trade. The only nation in the history of the world that has ever occupied that land as a bona fide nation of the world is the nation of Israel. Now, I will admit now it's miraculous, but a lot of people don't understand it or don't see it. It's miraculous that Israel has existed as a nation with borders and its own language and its own customs and its own cities and its own coinage and its own economy and its own government and its own leaders. It's miraculous that it has existed twice like that in world history. No other nation of the world has ever done that, by the way. There has never been a time where a nation has existed completely independently unique, and then it goes away for 2,000 years because it's conquered by other peoples, and then it comes back to the land? We'll talk more about that later. But there is a nation Israel there. It's there now, and it has been for over 60 years. But you need to understand that it is the only nation. There has never been a Palestinian nation there. Show me some Palestinian money. Show me an economy and governments and kings and cities and walls and international trade of the Palestinian people. It has never, ever happened. It has never existed. On the other hand, Israel has existed in the land, a historical, documented fact. No other nation has ever occupied that land as a bona fide nation but the nation of Israel. I mean, you know about King Saul and King David and King Solomon. Of course, after King Solomon, there was a civil war in that nation, and it was divided into the northern and southern kingdom. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. But even then, the nation lasted for over 500 years with kings, governments, militaries, borders, economy, trade, money. The only nation in the history of the world to ever have been established in that land was the nation of Israel. And guess what? Today, it is the only nation established in that little section of land in the world, the nation of Israel. Well, how did it all get started? Well, the Bible tells us, and archaeology confirms it, and other historical resources, but being a pastor and a Christian, I'm going to come from the biblical accounts here just for a little bit. But the Bible tells us that there were a people in the land of Egypt who were in bondage and slavery to the mighty Egyptian empire, which was the world power of its day. And these people were enslaved for almost 400 years. And they were none other than the children of Israel, or the children of Abraham, or the Hebrews. And history records and archaeology confirms that these people finally broke those bondages. Now, the Bible records a miraculous deliverance through the man Moses, and whether or not you believe the Bible really doesn't matter right now. The thing that matters is that the Israelis, the Hebrews, were in Egypt. They came out of Egypt, the whole nation of them. They were in the desert of Sinai for some 40 years, and then they entered into the land. Now, that land was occupied, but not by nations, but by tribal people, similar to when Europe came to the Americas. There were tribal people there, and those tribal people were warring against each other, all vying for power and for dominance and for territory. The same thing was going on in the land of what would eventually become Israel. And so the Hebrews went into the land. The Bible tells us, of course, and history records, they crossed over the Jordan. Their first conquest was the city of Jericho, the most, probably the most ancient city known to man from all the archaeological excavations and information we have today. They conquered Jericho. From there, they conquered the city of Ai, which was the military stronghold of Jericho. And from there, they then gained dominance of the land, which we now call Israel. The Bible records it. History records it. Archaeological excavations support it. And so these people went in, over 1 million of them went into the land, conquered the land, and began to settle the land. Now, for 300 or 400 years, they settled that land according to their tribes. There were 12 tribes of Israel. Most folks know that. And they settled that area, and they dominated that area, and held control of that area as a nation led by tribal leaders and a series of judges, is what the Bible calls them. And we would call them military heroes or heroes of the people, leaders of the people. And so they held the land for 300 to 400 years through this system of judges. Now, in just a moment when we come back, I'm going to tell you what happens next in Israel's history when they establish themselves as a bona fide nation with a system of kings and a military and an economy and international trade. You don't want to miss what you're going to hear next. So please stay tuned on the other side of the break, because when we get back, we're going to continue our discussion on the importance of the nation of Israel. Why is it the central focus of the headline news almost every day? And what does it have to do with our lives? What does it have to do with the political connections of America, for the political dealings of America? What does it have to do with our own national security? What does it have to do with the other nations of the world? On the other side of the break, we'll be right back. Let's take this brief time out.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
It's Freedom Friday. Welcome back. Well, you're back with your host, Carl Gallups. Thank you for hanging on through the break and joining us on the other side. Today, we're continuing our discussion with what's up with Israel. Who is Israel? Why is she in the land? Why do the Palestinians claim right to the land? Why do the nations of the world hate Israel? How is the United States involved in that? How is prophecy connected to all of that? Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about today, and we're so glad that you've joined us on this edition of Your Turn. Well, we left off just before the break, where we had established the historical, documented, verified through archaeology and other historical documents outside of the Bible. We had established that Israel came out of Egypt, let's just call them the Hebrews, the children of Israel, the children of Abraham, the children of Jacob, came out of Israel after some 400 years of captivity and bondage, came into the land of what we would now call Israel. The world calls it Palestine. We'll talk later about how it got that name. But they came into the land, crossed the Jordan, conquered Jericho, conquered Ai, conquered the land, settled it by the 12 tribes, and then for about 400 years ruled the land as a nation. Now, they didn't have kings, but they did have a system of leaders called judges. These were tribal leaders, and they did have a military. They had a united military among the various tribes. They fought many wars as they were attacked, and they held possession of the land as a people, well over 1 million strong. They held the land as a nation for 400 years. Folks, that's almost twice as long as the United States has been a nation. And as I said, prior to them entering the land, there were independent cities and or villages and or settlements. The place was settled by tribes of various peoples and various ethnicities, but there was no established nation in the land prior to Israel, nor has there ever been an established nation in that land other than Israel. So near the end then of that 400 years of being ruled by a system of judges, the last judge of Israel, if you will, would be the man by the name of Samuel. You read about him in the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, and of course in other historical sources. But Samuel would be the one that God would use to direct and anoint the first two kings of Israel, King Saul and King David. Let's talk about that for a moment. So you have this nation of people settled according to their 12 tribes, with a united military, holding a united border, holding a united nation together for 400 years, twice as long as the United States. At the end of that 400 years, they further established themselves as a bona fide nation through a system of kings and a government with palaces, with further extended borders, eventually coining money and engaging in trade and international affairs. So at the end of the 400 years, the first king that is appointed among the Israeli people, the Hebrew people in the land of Israel, the first king is King Saul. This is recorded in history. Of course, the Bible records it, but we know this. We know this as a fact. They had a king and a mighty nation. Millions of people with borders and a united military. And so King Saul reigned over Israel. Now, this is where it becomes fascinating. After King Saul's reign, of course, King David comes to the throne, probably one of the most famous kings among the nations in the world in all of history. And so for these naysayers that say that Israel never was a nation, Israel has no claim to the land, then explain King David. Explain 400 years of the nation of Israel existing even before King David came to power and came to rule as the king of Israel. And it was King David during his reign that would establish Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom. And it was King David who would arrange for the returning of the ark, which had been captured some several decades prior to that by the Philistines, and then eventually returned and kept in safekeeping by some Levites out in the countryside. But it was King David that would take that ark and would arrange for its return to Jerusalem, or its bringing into Jerusalem. It never was in Jerusalem, but so it wasn't returned to Jerusalem, but it was brought into Jerusalem. And then the tabernacle, which had been at Shiloh, which had been destroyed by the Philistines a couple of decades before, was now reconstructed and rebuilt in Jerusalem. The ark was placed in the tabernacle. The Levitical priestly line of daily sacrifices was reestablished by King David. Now there is a nation with its second king, with a capital in Jerusalem, the center of worship, the center of the military, the center of the economy, Jerusalem with King David. Now, one of King David's deepest desires was to establish Jerusalem as the center of worship, and he did do that. In fact, he's the one that made that happen. But one of his deepest desires was that he would be the one to build a temple, a constructed stone temple, rather than the tent-like tabernacle that was in Jerusalem and that had been in the wilderness for those 40 years with the Israelites, and then established for hundreds of years at Shiloh. But it was his deepest desire to build a temple in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible tells us that God made it very clear to David's heart that he was not the one to do it, but it would be one of his sons who would come after him. And sure enough, the Bible records, and history records, and archaeological discoveries verify that David's son Solomon, King Solomon, was the one who would eventually build the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon came to power after King David's death. Solomon, of course, another world-famous king. Who has not heard of King Solomon and his riches and his wisdom and his power and the mighty the mighty kingdom that he established, and the temple, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? It was built by the Palestinians? No. The Arabs? No. The Muslims? No. It was built by King Solomon. The Temple Mount, which is there today, are the ruins of, or what's left of, the remnants of Solomon's temple. The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem this day is the uncovered, excavated part of the Temple Mount. And many of the stones that are there, archaeologists believe, and the Jews believe, are the original stones laid by the builders of Solomon in the original temple which sat upon that site. Of course, now the Muslim Dome of the Rock is there, and we'll talk about all of that in a moment and how it got there. But King Solomon of Israel, of the Hebrews, after already hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years being established as a nation with judges and rulers and a military, now Solomon is the 3rd king in line behind Saul and David. Now a temple is built, and Israel is the only nation to have ever occupied that land. Now, one of the saddest chapters in Israel's national history was the death of King Solomon, because it was at his death and at his going out that various people of the land, including some of his military leaders and some of his own sons, began to jockey around for the power void that would be left, and certain factions were following certain people and leaders of Israel, and there was a civil war in Israel. The Bible records this. History records this. Oddly enough, the Civil War was between the North and the South. That's right. It's amazing how Israel's history, or how America's history, mirrors Israel's history in so many fascinating ways. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. But for right now, we want to emphasize that it was King Solomon, after King Solomon, when Israel's civil war occurred, and when the nation was divided into the 2 kingdoms. And it was with that division that the northern territory, or the northern kingdom, known as Israel, was established, with its capital at Samaria. And of course then, at the same time, the southern kingdom was established. It was known as Judah, and its capital was at Jerusalem. Now, for several hundred years more, these 2 parts of this nation would exist. Again, they were Hebrews, run by Hebrews, with Hebrew kings, kings of the northern kingdom, kings of the southern kingdom, kings of Israel, kings of Judah. These were not Palestinians, these were not Arabs. It was the nation of Israel, albeit a divided nation, but it was still the nation of Israel and the Hebrew people, who had established themselves for hundreds and multiplied hundreds of years as a bona fide nation. Now, what history records is that the Assyrian Empire was now on the rise as one of the world's up-and-coming superpowers. To make it a little easier to imagine this in your mind, if you're not too familiar with geography and history and maps, the Assyrian Empire would roughly encompass what is modern-day Iran, with a little bit of modern-day Iraq and some of the surrounding nations. But let's just say the Assyrian Empire would be roughly equivalent to modern-day Iran. And during the time of the divided kingdom of Israel, the Assyrian Empire arises as the world's superpower. Now the rulers and the leaders of the Assyrian Empire begin to eye that little piece of property on the Mediterranean, which has been so valuable and so lusted after for so long by so many, known as Israel. And the Assyrian leaders saw that Israel, the Hebrews, this nation of Israel, was now weakened because of its civil war. Because it was now, for all practical purposes, divided into two kingdoms of Hebrews, two nations of Israel, if you will, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the rulers of the Assyrian Empire saw this and decided to capitalize on it. And so attack after attack was launched against the northern kingdom until finally the northern kingdom succumbed and fell. Now, there's a whole lot that goes into this, a lot of political intrigue and history, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details. I'm just getting to the point here that the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrian Empire and was swallowed up in that. Now, it so happens that out of the 12 tribes that settled the land, roughly 10 of them made up this northern kingdom, and so these 10 tribes were taken off into captivity, if you will, taken off into the land of Assyria, swallowed up and assimilated by the Assyrian culture for many, many, many decades. And sometimes these are referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they intermixed and intermarried and intermingled with the Assyrians and all of the other people that the Assyrians had conquered. And when some of those people finally did come back to the land, they were not true Hebrews anymore. But the Assyrians conquered the northern empire. They made several attempts to conquer the southern empire, and the Bible records and history records that they were unable to do so. So the southern empire held pretty much intact, and they were a nation with their own kings for decades and decades that followed, with the nation called Judah and its capital at Jerusalem. Now, some years later, the next world empire, the next superpower that would arise on the world scene would be the nation or the empire of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire would be roughly equivalent to modern-day Iraq. Along the Tigris-Euphrates River and Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Who hasn't heard these from world history? And so what does world history record? That Nebuchadnezzar, like the Assyrian leaders, looked down at that stretch of land. Why is that stretch of land? Why is that little piece of land so valuable? Well, it's valuable because it's a natural land bridge between three continents. Israel connects Europe, Asia, and Africa. Plus, it's beautifully fertile, rich in natural resources. It's been said that the only real natural resource that they do not possess is oil products. But even now, as I'm doing this radio show, it's in the national news that oil is being discovered in Israel and natural gas reserves are being discovered in Israel. It's an amazing, amazing land, coveted for hundreds of years by many nations of the world. And so Nebuchadnezzar sees this land. He sets it in his heart to attack Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. What do we know from world history? Well, we know that eventually Nebuchadnezzar was successful. Nebuchadnezzar came in, destroyed the city, leveled the city, leveled the temple that Solomon had built, literally leveled it to the ground, and destroyed the Temple Mount, and took the remaining tribes of Israel into captivity in Babylon, and thus closes a sad chapter in Israel's history. Israel really existed no more after that until 1948. But there's a whole lot more that happens. Stay tuned on the other side of the break.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
It's Freedom Friday. Thank you for rejoining us on Your Turn. Your host, Carl Gallups. So many people are so upset and concerned with Israel in the land, and that they are occupiers and they have no right to be there, and the poor Palestinian people. But today we're getting to the truth, and what we have established is that Israel is the only bona fide nation that has ever been in that land. And we followed them from coming out of Egypt and coming into the land and settling the land by tribes and being in the land for some 400 years. We have followed them thus far in this part of the program through King Saul, through King David, through King Solomon, through the civil war in Israel between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So far we have followed the events of the northern kingdom being attacked by the Assyrian Empire, the major world empire of that day, roughly equivalent to modern day Iran. They were conquered, carried off into captivity. 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, attacks the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. They attack, they destroy the city, they destroy the city walls, they destroy Solomon's temple, they carry off the remaining tribes into captivity, into Babylon. The Bible records this. History records this. It's an undeniable fact. If there was no Israel, who did Babylon attack? Who did Nebuchadnezzar attack? What temple did they destroy? What city walls were destroyed? Why would they have to have a war? Why couldn't he just march in and take the land if there was no nation there? Of course there was. The nation of Israel. History goes on to record that the next empire on the world scene, the next major world superpower, was the Persian Empire. The Persians were a huge, monolithic empire. They were a barbaric, huge war machine. The Persian Empire makes up what is roughly equivalent to Iran and Iraq. The Persian Empire swallowed up then all of the captives of Assyria and Babylon out of ancient Israel. But the Persians did something amazing and unique. They allowed the captives of Israel who were living in the land, they allowed them, if they wanted to return back to their homeland and to reestablish the city of Jerusalem and the temple worship at Jerusalem. Now, as amazing as that sounds, you might ask, why would they do that? Well, history records they didn't allow them to return to become an independent nation. Oh, no. The Jews living in Jerusalem, even those living there and rebuilding the temple and worshiping in the temple and practicing their Jewish culture and faith, they were still members of, citizens of the Persian Empire. They were subjects of the Persian Empire. They had to pay taxes to the kings of Persia. But Persia did this because their empire was so huge, so far-stretching, so large, the largest empire the world had ever known up until that day. And one of the ways of controlling the populations, one of the ways of keeping the peace, was to allow the people, the various ethnic groups living within the empire, to live as closely as possible to their original customs. And so this was a brilliant move on the part of the Persians, to allow the Jews living in the land who wanted to return back to roughly the land of Israel and Jerusalem and to rebuild its walls and to rebuild the temple. And so history records that this happens. The Bible records that this happens. Archaeology verifies that this happens. The Jews returned. Many of them returned. Some of them didn't. Many of them had assimilated themselves into the Assyrian culture, the Babylonian culture, and now the Persian culture. But many of them returned home. They returned to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple walls, and they rebuilt the temple and the city walls, and they reestablished a form of temple worship. Now, the temple was never rebuilt to its original glory. Some of that would come along later under King Herod in New Testament days under the Roman Empire. But right now under the Persian Empire, history records that they went back and settled the land. Now, the next great empire on the world scene was the Greek Empire. The Persians and the Greeks were always fighting. The Persians were never able to completely conquer them, or were never able to conquer them. But the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, eventually conquered the mighty and the sprawling Persian Empire. After Alexander the Great died, the kingdom was split into 4 dynasties. One of the dynasties, the Seleucid dynasty, controlled the area of Jerusalem. And under one of its leaders, Antiochus Epiphanes, a great revolt, a Jewish revolt, took place called the Maccabean Revolt, or it's sometimes known as the Hasmonean Revolt, or the Hasmonean Dynasty. That took place under the Greek Empire. And then in 63 BC, a Roman general by the name of Pompey looked across the Mediterranean and saw the unrest and saw an opportunity to conquer. And the mighty Roman Empire was now on the rise. And the mighty Roman Empire sailed across the Mediterranean and laid waste to the area of Jerusalem And now Jerusalem and the Hebrews and the known world was now under the dominance and control of the Roman Empire, and the New Testament days were born. Stay tuned for more.
1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's Talk Radio. This is Your Turn, a live call-in show featuring spirited discussion and debate about issues that matter to the community. Stay with us to hear what Northwest Florida thinks. Better yet, call in at 623-1330 and tell us what you think. It's Your Turn here on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's Talk Radio. Now, here's the host of Your Turn.
You're back with Freedom Friday. Thank you so much for joining us in this second hour of Your Turn with your host, Carl Gallups. Well, we're doing a history lesson today. Today's show is very different, and in this second segment, we're going to continue. We'll do a recap of what we did in the first segment very quickly, and then we will continue on. Why is Israel so despised by the nations around it? Why does Israel have so few friends in the world? Who are the Palestinians? Why is the land called Palestine? Who are the people claiming that they have a right to the land and that they want to destroy Israel and drive the Jewish people into the sea and wipe them off the face of the earth? Where does all of this come from? It's extremely important that as Americans that we understand this, because we are connected historically, geographically, we are geopolitically, we are connected, and we are connected biblically and spiritually. Gain some understanding of this so that you might be educated, so that your children and grandchildren might be educated as to the truth, and so that you might help and serve to educate others. Because folks, I'm telling you, this is about world powers and world dominance, and it's about world survival, and it's about what's going on in the world right now. I'm going to be recapping and finishing up this understanding of the history of the nation of Israel, the fact that they are the only nation that has ever occupied that land, the only bona fide nation with kings and kingdoms and walls and cities and militaries and monetary units of trade and international trade and a language and a culture specific to it as a nation. They're the only bona fide nation that has ever, in the entirety of world history, that has ever lived in that land. And yet, there are many, many nations of the world refusing to even accept the legitimacy of Israel, Israel's history, or the fact that Israel ever lived there. So I'm glad you've joined with us. And after we finish this, in this next segment, this next hour of Your Turn, then I want to get in with you. I want to get into some understanding of some biblical prophecy. Now, whether this is not a preaching show, I am a preacher, but I'm not going to turn it into church. It's a historical biblical understanding of what the Bible says about Israel. Some amazing things that only the Bible says. No other religious book says these things about Israel, but the Bible has a lot to say about Israel and its place in the last days, its place in politics, its place in world affairs, and we are seeing those things born out before our eyes every day, folks. I'm telling you, this is extremely important to your life. The Bible has very specific prophecies about what was going to happen to Israel, and that Israel would return to the land. Folks, there were 2,000 years when there was no Israel. But Israel has returned to the land in our historical lifetime. We're watching it before our eyes, and the Bible went further than just saying it was going to come back to the land. The Bible went on to say that when it did return to the land, that very quickly world events were going to begin to unfold. Very quickly, events that would shape the world and fulfill biblical prophecy and usher in, the Bible says, usher in the return of Jesus Christ. Now, whether you believe the Bible or not, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a person of faith or not, it doesn't really matter. Listen to the show, because I think you're going to find this fascinating. Now, if you are a person of faith, if you are a person who believes the Bible is the Word of God, then you surely want to hear this show. And I'm kind of stalling a little bit because I'm hoping you'll be calling people and getting a hold of people and telling people how to tune in via the internet, 1330weby.com. They can go there and they can log on and they can listen to us live, streaming anywhere in the world. And plus, of course, we're right here on 1330 AM on your radio dial. 25,000 watts of power, WEBY, broadcasting all along the Gulf Coast from Milton, Florida, all the way to the edge of New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, listen, right before the break, at the top of the last hour, we finished this sweeping panoramic of the history of Israel. Now, I took a long time to give some fascinating details in the political inner workings, but let me just go back through it in a few sentences to bring everybody up to date. We trace the history of Israel. Now, these things are verified not only in the scriptures, but in historical sources and verified through archaeological discoveries and other extra-biblical historical sources that Israel, the Hebrews, were in captivity in Egypt. They came out of Egypt. They spent some 40 years wandering in the desert wilderness of the Sinai. They crossed the Jordan River. They conquered the city of Jericho. They conquered the military outpost of Jericho called Ai. They then conquered the land which we now call Israel, and most of the world calls Palestine, and you'll find out in the next few moments why it's called Palestine. But they conquered that land. They settled it according to their 12 tribes, and for 400 years, they occupied and possessed and settled that land, building cities and villages with a unified military under unified leaders called a system of judges, the Bible calls it, for 400 years. After that, of course, we had King Saul, the very first king. A government was established that would look like the governments of the world around it. Then King David, who established Jerusalem as the capital, brought the Ark of the Covenant there, established the tabernacle and the center of worship in Jerusalem, a further establishment of a mighty military, a monetary system, international trade. After King David came King Solomon, his son, who further established Jerusalem, built the temple, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. King Solomon ruled and reigned for many decades. People from all over the world knew of his wealth and his power and his wisdom and his glory. And then, of course, after his death, there was a civil war in Israel. The northern kingdom, known as Israel, with its capital at Samaria, and then the southern kingdom, known as Judah, established its capital at Jerusalem. And even though the nation was divided, they were still all Hebrews. It was still the nation of Israel, now a divided nation, sadly, through civil war, north and south. Does that sound familiar? And here was Israel, established in the land since about 1400 BC. And now we're around 900 BC. So for all of these years, it's established in the land, and now it's a divided nation. Of course, the Assyrian Empire rises on the scene, roughly modern-day Iran. They conquered the northern kingdom and carried them off into captivity. And then the southern kingdom arises as the world superpower. Babylon arises as the world superpower and directs its attention and focus to the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. And of course, it was conquered under King Nebuchadnezzar. And the temple was destroyed, and the walls were destroyed, and then the mighty Persian Empire came on the world scene as the next superpower, swallowed up the Babylonian, the Assyrian Empire, allowed some of the Jews that wished to return home to reestablish the city and the temple, and history records that they did it. The temple was rebuilt, not to its former glory, but it was rebuilt. The Bible records this, history records it, archaeology confirms it. The Persians did not allow the returning Hebrews to be their own independent nation, of course, but they were subjects to the Persian Empire. But the Hebrews returned. Why would they return? Because there was a Jerusalem. That was their capital. The Persians allowed them to do this to help keep peace among the large Jewish and Hebrew population that had been swallowed up by the Assyrians and the Babylonians that the Persians had inherited. For people to say that there was no Israel, they just are ignorant. Or they are lying to you. The Assyrians knew there was an Israel. Babylon knew there was an Israel. Egypt knew there was an Israel. Persia knew there was an Israel. Allowed them to return home and rebuild their temple and to rebuild their walls. And then after the Persian Empire came the mighty Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers all of the known world. After he died, his empire was broken up into dynasties, and one of the dynasties, the Seleucid dynasty, controls the area of Jerusalem and Israel, what we would call Israel now. But as it weakened, the Roman Empire was emerging across the Mediterranean. Under the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC, they sailed across and conquering the world, conquering the rest of the known world, conquering the ancient remnants of the Greek Empire, conquered the land of Israel. The Jews that were in the land now were under the Roman Empire, and that's where the pages of the New Testament open. They're now under Roman control and Roman dominance. Since about 586, 587 BC, though, they have not been a viable nation with kings and borders and militaries. But they had been, and now they're under the Roman Empire. So you see, Israel thrived as a recognizable, mighty, independent nation. Northern and Southern Kingdom for some of that, but they thrived there in the land from about 1400 BC until about 600 BC. So between 500 and 800 years, depending upon how you might want to define when they actually were a nation, but that's 2 to 3 to 4 times as long as the United States has been a nation. How can anyone in the world say that Israel has no claim upon the land? There has been no other nation that has ever lived in that land with a military and with money and with borders and with governments and with palaces and with world trade and economic trade with the people around it. There just hasn't been. It's only been Israel. All of the conquering empires that invaded that land recognized the nation of Israel and the Jewish people as the force to be reckoned with. From Egypt to Assyria to Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome. Now, this is where it gets fascinating. Under the Roman Empire, it was around 70 AD when there was a Jewish revolt in in Jerusalem. This is recorded in history. It's not recorded in the Bible because the Bible closes before all of this basically happened. But it is recorded in history. There was a revolt, an uprising in Jerusalem around 70 AD. The Romans were tired of dealing with the Jews and their politics and their religion and all of the intrigue, and now here was another revolt, and so the Romans decided to crush them and to destroy them once and for all and to expel them. And so in 70 AD, the Romans marched into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple again, which they had rebuilt under the Persians, and King Herod under the Roman Empire had further added to it. They destroyed what was then known as Herod's temple. And they leveled the city, they leveled the Temple Mount, and destroyed the city and expelled the Jews. Now this is where it's interesting. In expelling the Jews, in another attempt to get this Jewish situation under control, according to the Romans, they drove many of the Jews, most of the Jews, from the land. And when they drove them from the land, the Roman emperor then declared that the province of what would have been Israel and that area of Rome, declared that as the province of Palestine. That's where we get the word Palestine and Palestinians from. Palestine is an ancient Latin word meaning land of the Philistines. And the ancient Roman emperor called it the land of the Philistines because he knew this would enrage and infuriate the Jews, because the Philistines were the Jews' ancient enemies, and no Jew would want to live in the land of the Philistines or Palestine. And so people who now call themselves Palestinians, that's a misnomer. They totally are misleading. There are no Palestinians. It was called the land of Palestine by the Roman emperor attempting to enrage and to expel the Jews from the area and attempting to ensure that they would never return. Oh, but return they did. And we're going to talk more about that on the other side of this break. You don't want to miss what's coming next in our understanding of the truth of Israel.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
All right, well, welcome back. WBY 1330, Carl Gallups, your host of Your Turn. Well, we left off understanding how Palestine got its name. It got its name from the Roman emperor who designated it with that Latin name of Palestine, which literally means in Latin, the land of the Philistines, around 70 A.D., when the Roman Empire decided that it was going to once and for all drive the Jews out of the area of Israel. And so they named it Palestine in order to enrage and to infuriate the Jews and try to ensure that the Jews would not return back to that area. So that's where the name Palestine comes from. And so this understanding of, or the misuse of the term Palestine and Palestinians is an understanding that most of the world doesn't have today. Most people think that the word Palestine refers to an area that belongs to a particular group of people called Palestinians, who most people think are Arabs, who most people think are Muslims. Therefore, it belongs to the Muslim Arabs. But absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. So let's get back to 70 A.D. So the Romans drove out the Jews and destroyed the temple and destroyed the Temple Mount and destroyed again a lot of the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and many of the Jews were dispersed. So now, since the Assyrians invaded and conquered the northern kingdom and the Babylonians invaded and conquered the southern kingdom, for hundreds and hundreds of years, right up to 70 A.D. now, there is no real nation of Israel, and Jews have been dispersed throughout the Roman Empire and throughout the world. Of course, a large population still living in Jerusalem and in and around what would be called the nation of Israel, but now they are dispersed under the Roman Empire. But now, of course, a lot of Jews still lived in the area, and from 70 A.D. right on up through about World War I, Jews were living in and around that area. There were Arabian people, Arab people, cousins to the Israelites, really, through Ishmael. They were living in and about the land. These people today, a lot of them are called Palestinians, but they're not descendants of the Philistines. The Philistines are a whole separate race and ethnicity of people. They're Arabs. The people who are generally called Palestinians today, they're Arabs. And they illegitimately lay claim to this land of Israel today. And the news media fosters it. And I don't know if it's on purpose, probably so, or just by pure ignorance. Probably both of them go hand in hand. But anyway, this area then of Israel was continually inhabited, really from that time on, by a remnant of Jews still in the land, and Arabs in the land, and various conquering nations and ethnic groups living in and around that land, including the Ottoman Turks and the who conquered the land, and the Muslim invaders who would conquer the land. By the way, Islam was not even born until around 600 A.D. That's the time of Muhammad, when he supposedly had his visions and wrote the Quran and established the religion of Islam. So the Muslim religion of Islam has only been around 600 A.D. And then it was around 700 A.D., or the late 600s, when the Muslim Dome of the Rock was built on top of the Temple Mount as a sign of Muslim dominance in the area. So it was around World War I, around 1918 in World War I, when the British took control of this area as a part of the spoils of war from World War I. The British took control of this area and then renamed it or redesignated it Palestine after the ancient Roman designation. And that's how that word Palestine came to be used more in the modern vernacular. Now, in 1923, the British divided that area of what they were calling Palestine. They divided it into two districts. One district west of the Jordan River, they called it Palestine. We would call it now modern-day Israel. And then east of the Jordan River, they called the Transjordan. That was in 1923. Now, the Jews were permitted, under Great Britain and their rule of that area, they were permitted to live only west of the Jordan River. And then in 1946, Transjordan was renamed Jordan. And of course, you're familiar with the nation of Jordan. And so that all of that area was determined and settled by the British Empire as the spoils of war of World War I. So by 1946, you now had what Britain was calling Palestine and Jordan. And all of the area west of the Jordan, or Palestine, was to be called the Jewish homeland, or the Jewish Palestine homeland, or the Jewish Palestinian homeland. But the Arabs didn't see it that way. They wanted it all, and they wanted the Jews expelled. And then, of course, the next step in history is when Hitler begins his persecution and destruction of the Jews who lived in the various European countries. Now World War II is upon us. And at the conclusion of World War II, 1945, the survivors of the death camps, the Hebrew survivors, the Jewish survivors, they had no nation to go to. They had no homeland to go to. Of course, many of them came to the United States of America, and until just recently, the vast majority of the Jewish population of the world lived in the United States of America. And I say until just recently because some of the demographic reports coming out of Israel now has the Israeli population of Jews or Hebrews now exceeding or getting ready to exceed the Jewish population of the United States. But when they came out of these death camps and at the end of World War II, they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have any homeland to return to. So a lot of them who were not killed then fled, of course, to the United States, but a lot of them fled back to the ancient area of Israel, or what the world was calling Palestine. These people would be the ones to help create the new Jewish state of Israel in 1948. But before we get there, we'll go to 1947, a couple of years after World War II had ended. The British in 1947 finally had enough of trying to rule and occupy this area with all of its cultural and ethnic problems, and so they turned the control of this area over to none other than the wonderful, illustrious organization that has so blessed the world and has so enriched the lives of the Israeli people. The British turned it over to the United Nations. And the United Nations immediately went about setting out to divide the land between the Jews and the Arabs living in the same land. And so the United Nations delineated certain areas of land for the Jews and certain areas of land for the Arabs. When we get back on the other side of the break, we'll continue with the truth about Israel.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
Okay, welcome back, WBY. Carl Gallups, thank you for staying with us on the other side of the break. Well, let's get back to the story of Israel. We left off with what happened now after World War II. Then that was about 1945, of course. And then in 1947, the British, who had controlled that area, and they had renamed that area of what we would call Israel, they had renamed it Palestine. Now in 1947, a couple of years after World War II had ended, the British finally decided they'd had enough of trying to rule that area and dealing with the Jews and the different ethnic groups that lived in the area, and some who had dominated and controlled the area, and then the Jews who were still claiming it, of course, as their ancient homeland and the land of their fathers and the nation that they had had before. The British finally had had enough of it, and they turned control of the area over to the United Nations. And a lot of people don't realize this. And so the United Nations, they divided that whole area into what they called Jewish Palestine and Arab Palestine, based upon population concentrations. Well, the Jewish people accepted the United Nations declaration and division of the land, but the Arabs didn't. Why? Because they wanted it all. They claimed that it was theirs, and the Jews didn't even need to live there. Now, if you've heard the rest of the show today, you know what an out-and-out falsehood that is, what an out-and-out lie it is. But this lie, this falsehood, has continued to be perpetrated and spread by the modern-day news media, and, of course, by the Muslims themselves. And so, as I said, the United Nations divided it, Jewish Palestine, Arab Palestine. The Jews accepted, the Arabs didn't. They wanted it all. Now, because the United Nations had given a certain portion of the Palestine area to the Jews and said, this is Jewish Palestine. Now, what's interesting, some Arabs were living in Jewish Palestine, by the way, peacefully with the Jews. The Jews weren't doing anything to them. But since the United Nations had designated this, then in 1948, on May the 14th actually, the Jewish Palestinians declared themselves independent, and they named themselves Israel. Now get this. It had been the nation of Israel for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, with kings, Saul, David, Solomon, with money, with militaries, with cities, with temples, with international trade. Yes, they had been conquered by other nations throughout the world. What nations hadn't been eventually conquered? Every mighty empire that's ever existed has eventually been conquered by another mighty empire. The Jews were conquered, but that does not negate the fact that they were the first, and by the way, to this day, the only people who had ever lived in that land who had a bona fide, legitimate nation. And now, here it is, 1948, the United Nations has declared, okay, Jews, this section of land right here is yours. Do with it what you wish. And the Jews said, okay, this is cool. We'll reestablish Israel. So on May the 14th, 1948, kind of like our Declaration of Independence and the signing of our Constitution a few years later, we established ourselves, our colonies, and said, okay, we're a nation. We're independent from Great Britain. Well, the Jews did the same thing. They said the UN, the United Nations, the nations united, have given us this land. We will now declare ourselves a new nation. That was May the 14th, 1948. The next day, 7 neighboring Arab nations attacked them. A 19-month war ensued. When the 19-month war had ended, Israel had defeated all of its enemies. But some 400,000 Arab Palestinians, okay, you get the distinction there. They're not Palestinians by some kind of race or ethnicity. That's just what the area was designated by the Roman emperors and then Great Britain and then the United Nations. So the Arabs living in the area, they fled the land in fear of that war when the war broke out. 400,000 of them left. But Israel won that war 19 months later. So the remaining Arabs that were still there, staying in Israel, they were assimilated really rather peacefully into the Israeli population. To this day, there are Jews and Arabs living all over the nation of Israel. Some neighborhoods are side by side, and they get along just fine. I've been to Israel. I've been in some of those neighborhoods, and there's not a problem. And it's been that way since the inception of the nation in 1948. But the 400,000 or so that fled because of the seeds, became the seeds of the Palestinian liberation movement, and they called themselves the Palestinian refugees. They weren't refugees. They left. Nobody kicked them out. Israel didn't kick them out. It's just that Israel, once it declared itself as a nation, was attacked the next day. And so for 19 months, they were at war with 7 surrounding Arab nations. So the 400,000 Arabs that fled, they said, we want to go back to our homeland. What homeland? They didn't have a homeland. They really weren't even supposed to be in that area anyway. They had their own Arab Palestine. Egypt, in that war, at the end of that 19-month war, they had essentially won, if you will, the Gaza Strip area. and Jordan, remember it used to be called Transjordan, they had won the West Bank area, including Jerusalem. So at the end of that 19-month war, after Israel declared its independence, then there's little Israel, brand new nation. It didn't have the Gaza Strip as a part of it. It didn't have Jerusalem or the West Bank. Now Jordan then granted all of these Arab refugees, the ones that were calling themselves the Palestinian refugees, Jordan granted them full citizenship and gave them the West Bank as their home. Now that should clear up a lot of confusion for people who have been wondering about this for years. What's the deal about the West Bank? And what's the deal about the Palestinians settling the West Bank and Israel building settlements in the West Bank? Well, that's what it's about. Now, let's go up to 1967. In May of 1967, there's another war. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. They plotted against Israel, and they began to mobilize along Israel's border in order to finally eliminate the nation of Israel. But Israel launched a preemptive strike. They found out about it, and they launched a preemptive strike. This is back in 1967 against Egypt's Air Force. Within 2 hours, they had rendered Egypt's Air Force useless. And the other nations, Jordan and Syria, they didn't know this. They were unaware of it. That's back before the days of cell phones and internet and satellite communications. And so they unleashed their armies into the belly of Israel, coming down from the Golan Heights for a surprise attack, thinking that Egypt was going to back them up. But Egypt had been rendered useless by a surprise attack of the Israelis. After only 6 days of war, this is the infamous 6-day war, Israel had defeated its enemies once again and had reclaimed now the West Bank area and the holy city of Jerusalem, its ancient capital under King David, and in addition they had captured the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Desert, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Israel now had control of all of that as the spoils of war after they had been attacked, simply attempting to live peacefully in the land. But unfortunately, you see, the rest of the world didn't see Israel as a winner claiming its rights to spoils of war, but rather Israel was considered to be, of all things, an occupier. Now the 850,000 Arabs living in the Gaza Strip joined with the former Arabs who were expelled during the War of 1948, who left. They weren't expelled, but who left during the War of 1948 and who had declared themselves once again refugees. And they all joined together from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, and they said, "We're refugees. We're Palestinian refugees, and we vow to destroy Israel and to retake our land." Folks, do you smell the hypocrisy and the lies of this? Supported by the Muslim world, supported by much of the European world, supported by much of the anti-Semitic press. Isn't this amazing once you know the truth of what really happened? Then, of all things, after Israel now has recaptured Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Jerusalem, in 1982, at the Camp David Peace Accord, the United States of America, Jimmy Carter, persuaded Israel to give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Give it back in exchange for peace. But the Arabs were still not satisfied. Even after Israel gave up the land, the Arabs were still not satisfied, and they still declared that they were going to annihilate Israel. What many people today don't know is that many of these so-called Palestinian refugees, they were expelled by Jordan in the 1970s and the 1980s because of continual clashes with the Jordanian authorities and the military. And those so-called refugees that Jordan had taken in with open arms were troublemakers. They were thugs and terrorists and militants. And so Jordan expelled them. And of course, out of that expulsion from Jordan grew this thing called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, eventually headed by Yasser Arafat, who's now dead. But ever since then, the PLO has been recognized by all the Arab nations, and at times even the United States, as a legitimate authority with which to hold talks and try and sign treaties with. But in reality, the PLO and the Palestinian refugees, in reality, they're terrorist thugs with which even Jordan did not want to deal. Is there no wonder why Israel gets so upset with the United States when we give the Palestine Liberation Organization and its resulting terrorist branches this kind of legitimization? Is it no wonder? It would be as though Israel recognized Al-Qaeda as an independent nation or a sovereign legitimate authority with which the U.S. should negotiate with. And it would be as if Israel was always dogging us to negotiate with Al-Qaeda because, after all, Al-Qaeda have legitimate concerns, and these are legitimate people and maybe even a legitimate nation. That's how Israel feels when we and other nations urge it and encourage it and sometimes even force it to deal with the PLO and its resulting organizations. It's absolutely astounding, folks. It's absolutely amazing. And during the past decade, Israel gave the land, evacuating South Lebanon in 2000. You remember that? They left South Lebanon, wherein they had been being attacked from terrorist organizations of Lebanon to its northern borders. They gave that up in 2000 at the urging of the world. And then in 2005, do you remember? They gave up the Gaza Strip. And what did it get Israel? Nothing but an intensification of belligerence and militarization of the enemy side, multiple kidnappings and cross-border attacks and rocket attacks, unrelenting. Is there any wonder why Israel shrugs its shoulders and throws up its hands and says, "What's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world around us?" So today, much of the world, almost all the world, I guess, except for the United States, at times anyway, and Great Britain, still considers Israel to be an occupier of the land. Up until just recently, the United States has been the greatest and biggest and best ally of Israel, and Israel certainly has been a huge ally of ours and a great, important strategic friendship in the Middle East. And the battle rages on. Historic Israel is back in the land as a nation, just as the Bible had long before predicted would happen. Now, it's been attacked by enemies time and time again, and it's never been defeated. It's still there, coming back to the land in 1948 as a nation. Now, when we get back from the break, I am going to share some astounding information with you from the Bible concerning the prophecy of all of this that we've just discussed, as well as end-time prophecies of how Israel is a pointing sign to what is getting ready to happen in the world. Folks, there is a coming World War III. I hope it's not in our lifetime, but it's coming, and you can see it brewing, and you can see it brewing in the Middle East, and you can see that Israel is at the center focus of it all. And the Word of God for thousands of years has told us that this was going to happen. On the other side of the break, I'll give you the details.
Now, back to your turn on 1330 WEBY, Northwest Florida's talk radio. The phone lines are open, so call in and join the conversation at 623-1330.
You're listening to Freedom Friday. Okay, welcome back. Welcome to this final segment of Your Turn. WEBY 1330, Carl Gallups, your host. Thank you for hanging in here with me today, folks. I know that it's been a different show. You've been listening to Professor Gallups today as we've brought you a history lesson. And in these final remaining moments, really the most exciting part of all of this to me are the biblical and prophetic ramifications of everything that I've already shared with you. Today, I have given you the insight and the understanding of the truth of Israel, how it's there, why it's there, when it came to be there, why people hate it so much, what's up with this Palestinian refugee thing, what's up with people calling themselves Palestinians and that they have a claim and a sole right to the land, what's up with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What's up with all of that? Why is it that the United States and Great Britain have been so connected to Israel? And we really haven't gotten into the depths of that, but at least you have a good understanding of all of that. The main thing I wanted you to take away from all that I've already presented is that Israel is the only nation in the history of the world that has ever laid claim to that land that we call Israel. Some call it Palestine. The only nation in the history of the world to ever lay claim to it as a bona fide nation. The only nation. There has never been another nation in the land. There certainly has not been a Palestinian nation. There has been no... You can show me some Palestinian money. Show me a Palestinian palace and government and Congress. There never has been. Show me a Palestinian military under a Palestinian leader, under a Palestinian king. There never has been. Yet Israel was there with a king, with a military, with an economy, with money, with international trade, with borders, with cities, with a capital, with a temple, with everything for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's Israel's land, folks. The Bible says it, history says it, and archaeology says it. Now let me tell you what else the Bible says. For thousands of years, the Bible prophesied that Israel would be God's sign to the world, that He exists and only He exists, and He is the only God, and the Bible is His only word. He said, I'll tell you how I will prove my existence. I will tell you how I will prove that this word is the only true word of the true living God, Yahweh. God says in various places, in Old Testament and then through the New Testament, out of the mouth of Jesus, God in the flesh, God told us that He would do it through the nation of Israel as His sign. He said, I'm going to take a people who are not a people. I'm going to turn them into a mighty people, turn them into a mighty land, and I will establish them in the land. I will do that. I will bring them out of slavery and bondage and captivity. Well, folks, history bears out that happened. He said, and then I'm going to surround them with their enemies, and as long as they will keep their eyes on me and worship me and be faithful to me, they will never be defeated. But in the day they take their eyes off of me, God said, I will scatter them to the four corners of the earth. Those things happened through all the history that I've already shared with you. Then God said, amazingly, for thousands of years, this prophecy lied dormant in God's word. He said, but in the last days, I will raise them up. I will bring them back. The whole 37th chapter of Ezekiel is about the valley of the dry bones, the vision that Ezekiel saw of a bunch of dead bones in a valley coming back to life. And in that passage, God says, I'm telling you, Ezekiel, this is the whole house of Israel. This is the nation of Israel that you're seeing. I will pour into them my breath, my life. I will make them a nation again. I will bring them back to life. I will bring them back to this land. And he tells Ezekiel that it's going to happen in the last days. And then surprisingly, in chapters 38 and 39 of Ezekiel, God shows Ezekiel the very last days when the nations of Iran and Russia and Syria and Turkey all join forces with other nations and they attack Israel in the last days. Folks, we're watching the beginnings of that right now on our television sets. We're watching these things unfold as the leaders of Iran breathe out threats, the leaders of Syria and now Turkey and Russia and surrounding nations, Lebanon, other nations continually breathing out threats, the Muslim world, Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinians, the Hamas, the various terrorist organizations, all proclaiming that they want Israel wiped off the map and driven into the sea. And the Bible said that this was going to happen. And the Bible told us for thousands of years before it came to pass. Ezekiel was written about 2,600 years ago, yet it reads like the headlines of today's news. Folks, I'm telling you, we are living in biblical prophetic times. Whether you profess to be a Christian or a believer of the Bible or not, it really doesn't matter. The Bible has been there long before we have been here. Long before you and I draw our first breath as babies when that doctor spanked our bottom, the Bible had been proclaiming that these things would happen, and now we're watching them unfold on our television sets. The Quran doesn't talk about it. The Vedas doesn't talk about it. Confucius nor Buddha talks about it. Only the Word of God, and only Yahweh, the living God, and Jesus Christ, God's representation of himself on earth. God says, this is how you will know that I am the only God, and the Bible is the only Word. Well, folks, I hope you've learned some things today. It's been my joy to present all of this to you. Sorry for the different kind of show, but I hope it has been a blessing and inspiration and encouragement and informative to you. Thank you for joining this edition of Your Turn. God bless you.